In 1909, the Hartwell family farm in rural Indiana became home to something that defied every law of nature. What started as a simple prayer for children turned into a nightmare that consumed an entire bloodline. The townsfolk called it a blessing. The church called it divine intervention. But when investigators arrived 3 months later, they found something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface of this growing family. The official records were sealed. The farmhouse was burned to the ground. And the truth about what really happened to the Hartwells remained buried for over a century. Until now. Marthe Hartwell stood in her kitchen on a cold February morning, watching the snow fall across the empty fields. She had been married to Thomas for 12 years, and in all that time, their prayers had gone unanswered. The other women in Millfield County whispered behind her back at church gatherings. Barren, they called her. Cursed. At 34, Marthe had given up hope of ever holding a child of her own. Thomas worked their 100-acre farm alone, his back bent from years of labor that should have been shared with sons. The isolation of their remote property, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, had become a constant reminder of their childless existence. Every empty bedroom in their 2-story farmhouse echoed with the absence of laughter and small feet. That February night changed everything. Marthe found the letter tucked under their front door the next morning. No postmark, no return address. Just yellowed parchment with elegant handwriting that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. The message was simple. Your prayers have been heard. Prepare your home for the family you have always wanted. Thomas dismissed it as a cruel joke from the townspeople, but Marthe kept the letter, studying those strange words that seemed to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at them. 3 days later, she collapsed in the barn while gathering eggs. Dr. Morrison arrived from town that evening, his medical bag rattling as his horse struggled through the February snow. After examining Marthe, his face went pale. He pulled Thomas aside and spoke in hushed tones about impossibilities and medical miracles. Marthe was pregnant. Not just pregnant, but far along. Her belly showed signs of being at least 4 months into term, though she had shown no symptoms just days before. The pregnancy progressed at an alarming rate. Within 2 weeks, Marthe looked ready to give birth. Her body changed so rapidly that her clothes became useless overnight. Thomas sent word to the midwife in town, but by the time Mrs. Henley arrived, Marthe was already in labor. The birth itself defied explanation. Marthe delivered not 1 child, but 3. Triplets born just minutes apart, each perfectly healthy and unusually large for newborns. Thomas named them Samuel, Sarah, and Solomon. The babies never cried. They watched everything with dark, knowing eyes that seemed far too old for their tiny faces. But the strangeness had only begun. Within a month, Marthe was pregnant again. This time, doctor. Morrison refused to believe his own examination. The pregnancy symptoms appeared overnight, just as before. Her belly expanded at the same impossible rate. Thomas tried to convince himself this was a blessing, but something deep in his gut told him otherwise. The second birth brought 4 more children: Rebecca, Ruth, Robert, and Rachel. 7 children in 2 months. The farmhouse filled with the sounds of life, but it wasn't the joyful noise Marthe had dreamed of. These children were different. They grew faster than normal babies should. By their 2nd week of life, they appeared months old. By their 1st month, they looked like toddlers. The children never spoke, but they seemed to communicate through glances and gestures. They moved together like a single organism, their actions perfectly synchronized. When one was hungry, all 7 would gather at Marthe's side. When one was tired, all 7 would lie down in the same position. Marthe's 3rd pregnancy began before the 2nd set of children reached 2 months old. This time, she gave birth to 5 more: Matthew, Mark, Miriam, Mary, and Moses. 12 children in 4 months. The farmhouse groaned under the weight of so many occupants. Thomas struggled to provide for the growing family. The children consumed food at an alarming rate, growing larger and stronger each day. By their third month, the oldest looked like children of 5 or 6 years. They helped with farm work without being asked, their small hands surprisingly capable of adult tasks. The townspeople began to take notice. Word spread through Millfield County about the miraculous Hartwell family. Visitors arrived daily, some calling it a divine blessing, others whispering about dark magic. The local preacher, Reverend Hayes, declared it a sign of God's favor, but his hands shook when he held the children, and he never stayed long during his visits. Martha's 4th pregnancy brought 6 more children. Her 5th brought 7. By summer, 25 children lived in the Hartwell farmhouse. They ranged in apparent age from newborn to 10 years old, though none had actually lived longer than 6 months. The children had begun to speak by then, but only to each other. Their language was unlike anything Thomas or Martha had ever heard. It sounded ancient, with rolling consonants and clicking sounds that human throats shouldn't be able to produce. When adults approached, the children would fall silent and stare with those same dark, knowing eyes. Strange things began happening around the farm. Crops grew in perfect geometric patterns overnight. Dead animals appeared arranged in circles in the fields, their bodies unmarked but completely drained of blood. The well water turned black for 3 days, then ran clear again without explanation. Thomas tried to contact Dr. Morrison, but the doctor refused to return to the farm. Mrs. Henley, the midwife, had stopped coming after the 4th birth. She claimed the children watched her with eyes that saw too much, and spoke of nightmares that plagued her for weeks after each visit. Martha's pregnancies continued relentlessly. Every 6 to 8 weeks, she would conceive again, each time delivering more children than before. Her body should have been destroyed by the constant strain, but she remained healthy and strong. Too strong. She could lift a full-grown cow without effort and work for days without rest. The children's growth had stabilized somewhat. The oldest appeared to be around 12 years old, while the newest still looked like infants. But their behavior grew more disturbing with each passing week. They would gather in the fields at night, standing in perfect formations under the moonlight. Their synchronized movements looked like some kind of ritual, though Thomas could never get close enough to see exactly what they were doing. By autumn, 43 children lived on the Hartwell farm. The farmhouse had been expanded multiple times, with new rooms appearing overnight as if built by invisible hands. The architecture made no sense. Rooms connected to each other in impossible ways. Stairs led to floors that shouldn't exist. Windows showed views of landscapes that weren't anywhere near Indiana. The children had divided themselves into groups based on their apparent ages. The oldest, who now looked like teenagers, had taken on leadership roles. They organized the younger ones into work crews that maintained the farm with supernatural efficiency. The crops had never been more abundant, but the produce looked wrong. Corn grew in spirals. Tomatoes pulsed like beating hearts. Wheat stalks moved without wind, bending toward anyone who approached. If you're wondering how this story gets even more twisted, make sure to subscribe, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about the Hartwell family. Martha's pregnancies had become a monthly occurrence. Each birth brought larger groups of children, and each group seemed more coordinated than the last. The newest arrivals no longer needed time to learn how to walk or eat. They emerged from the womb already knowing things they shouldn't know, speaking that strange ancient language fluently from their first breath. Thomas began keeping a journal, documenting the impossible events unfolding in his home. His entries grew more frantic as the months progressed. He wrote about finding the children in the barn at dawn, standing around symbols carved into the dirt floor. He described discovering rooms in his house that he had never built, filled with objects that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The children's eyes had changed color. What started as dark brown had shifted to black, then to a color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When they looked at Thomas, he felt something cold and ancient staring back at him. Martha seemed unaware of these changes, speaking to the children as if they were perfectly normal babies and toddlers. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow in October and temperatures that should have been impossible for Indiana. The children seemed unaffected by the cold. They played outside in the snow, wearing only thin clothing, their breath never visible in the frigid air. Neighbors reported seeing lights moving across the Hartwell property at all hours, accompanied by sounds that resembled singing but in no earthly language. The local sheriff, William Crawford, finally decided to investigate after receiving numerous complaints from nearby farmers. Their livestock had been acting strangely, cattle and horses refusing to graze in fields that faced the Hartwell property. Chickens wouldn't lay eggs. Dogs howled continuously throughout the night. Sheriff Crawford's first visit to the farm took place on a gray December morning. He found Thomas working alone in the fields, looking haggard and much older than his 41 years. When Crawford asked about the children, Thomas's response was barely coherent. He spoke about blessings turning into curses and prayers that should never have been answered. Crawford counted 67 children during his visit. They ranged from apparent newborns to what looked like young adults in their early 20s. The older ones watched him with barely concealed hostility, their movements too coordinated to be natural. When he tried to speak to some of the younger-looking children, they responded in that strange language he had heard reports about. Martha appeared to be pregnant again, her belly enormous despite claiming to be only a few weeks along. She served Crawford coffee that tasted like nothing he had ever experienced, bitter and sweet at the same time, leaving his mouth feeling numb for hours afterward. She spoke cheerfully about her growing family, seeming genuinely happy despite the obvious strain the situation was placing on their resources. Crawford left the farm that day with more questions than answers. His official report, filed with the county courthouse, described the Hartwell family as unusual but not criminal. However, his personal notes told a different story. He wrote about children who moved like a single organism, about rooms that were larger inside than they appeared from outside, and about Martha's eyes, which had begun to change color just like her children's. The final pregnancy was different from all the others. Martha's labor lasted 3 days, during which strange lights could be seen from miles away emanating from the farmhouse. The sounds coming from the property were described by witnesses as voices singing in harmony, but not human voices. When the labor finally ended, Martha had delivered 13 children simultaneously. These final children were unlike the others. They emerged already appearing to be 5 or 6 years old, walking and speaking fluently in both the ancient language and perfect English. They showed no signs of being newborns, as if they had skipped infancy entirely. Their eyes were completely black, reflecting no light at all. Thomas's journal entries from this period are barely legible. His handwriting had deteriorated into frantic scrawls, and many passages were written in the same ancient language the children used. The final entry, dated January 15, 1910, contained only one line written in English. "They are not children." Sheriff Crawford's second visit to the farm came 3 days later, accompanied by 2 deputies and Dr. Morrison, who had finally agreed to return after months of Crawford's persuasion. They found the farmhouse empty except for Thomas, who was sitting alone in the kitchen staring at a cold cup of coffee. Thomas appeared to have aged decades in the weeks since Crawford's last visit. His hair had turned completely white, and his face was deeply lined. When asked about Martha and the children, he claimed not to know what Crawford was talking about. He insisted he and Martha had never been able to have children, that they had lived alone on the farm for their entire marriage. Dr. Morrison's examination of the farmhouse revealed no signs that children had ever lived there. The rooms that had been expanded to accommodate the growing family had returned to their original size and layout. The cribs, toys, and children's clothing that had filled the house just days before had vanished without a trace. The only evidence that anything unusual had occurred was found in the barn. Carved into the dirt floor was a complex geometric pattern unlike anything Crawford had ever seen. The symbols seemed to shift and move when viewed directly, causing headaches and nausea in anyone who stared at them for too long. Dr. Morrison refused to enter the barn after his first glimpse of the markings. Martha was nowhere to be found. Thomas claimed she had gone to visit her sister in Ohio, but county records showed Martha had no living relatives. Her disappearance was officially listed as a missing person case, but no investigation was ever conducted. The strange events didn't end with the discovery of the empty farmhouse. Neighbors continued to report unusual activity on the Hartwell property throughout the winter. Lights moved across the fields at night, and the sounds of children playing could be heard echoing across the snow-covered landscape. Livestock in the area continued to behave erratically, and several farmers reported finding their animals dead in the morning, arranged in perfect circles with no signs of injury. Thomas lived alone on the farm for another 2 months, becoming increasingly isolated and incoherent. The few visitors who encountered him during this period described a man who seemed to be carrying on conversations with invisible companions. He was often seen setting the table for dozens of people, preparing enormous meals that he would then leave untouched. On March 20th, 1910, the Hartwell farmhouse burned to the ground. Thomas was found dead inside, though the coroner couldn't determine a cause of death. His body showed no signs of burns, despite being found in the center of the inferno. The fire was blamed on a faulty chimney, but several witnesses reported seeing the flames burn in colors that fire shouldn't produce. The official investigation was led by State Inspector James Morton, who arrived from Indianapolis a week after the fire. His preliminary report described the incident as a tragic accident involving a mentally unstable farmer who had suffered a psychological breakdown after the death of his wife. According to Morton's finding, Thomas and Marthe Hartwell had been childless throughout their marriage, and Thomas's claims about having dozens of children were the result of a severe mental illness. However, Morton's private correspondence, discovered decades later in state archives, told a very different story. In letters to his supervisor, Morton described finding evidence that contradicted his official report. Clothing and personal items belonging to dozens of children had been found in the ashes, though these items were omitted from the public record. More disturbing were the photographs Morton took of the burn site, which showed shadows on the ground in the shapes of human figures, far too many to be explained by just Thomas and Marthe. The land where the Hartwell farm once stood was purchased by the county and designated as a nature preserve. Official records claimed this was done to prevent further development in an area prone to flooding, but local residents knew the real reason. Strange phenomena continued to occur on the property for years after the fire. Hikers reported hearing children's voices calling for help deep in the woods where no children should have been. Hunting parties found circles of dead animals arranged in the same geometric patterns that had been carved into the Hartwell barn. Park rangers refused to patrol the area after dark, claiming their equipment malfunctioned whenever they approached the site of the former farmhouse. The most disturbing reports came from families with young children who visited the preserve. Parents described their children becoming entranced when entering the area, standing motionless and staring at empty spaces as if seeing something the adults couldn't. Some children began speaking in unknown languages during these episodes, using the same clicking sounds and rolling consonants that witnesses had described hearing from the Hartwell children. In 1925, a team of researchers from Indiana University attempted to conduct a scientific investigation of the preserve. Led by Professor Harold Whitman, the team included anthropologists, historians, and a psychologist specializing in mass hysteria. Their goal was to debunk the local legends and provide rational explanations for the reported phenomena. The team's research lasted only 3 days. Professor Whitman's final report, which was classified by the university and not released until 1975, described events that challenged everything the researchers thought they knew about reality. Equipment failures, impossible temperature readings, and encounters with what Whitman described as entities presenting as children but possessing knowledge and abilities beyond human understanding. The most chilling discovery was made on the final day of the investigation. While excavating the foundation of the burned farmhouse, the team uncovered a basement room that didn't appear on any of the original building plans. The room contained evidence of long-term habitation by numerous children, including toys, clothing, and furniture. Carbon dating of the artifacts produced impossible results, showing ages that predated the construction of the farmhouse by hundreds of years. Inside this hidden room, carved into the stone walls, were symbols matching those found in the barn after the family's disappearance. But these carvings were far more extensive, covering every surface in intricate patterns that seemed to form a kind of map or diagram. Professor Whitman's attempts to document the symbols were frustrated by their apparent ability to change when not being observed directly. The final straw came when team member Dr. Sarah Chen, the expedition's anthropologist, encountered what she described in her notes as a group of children who weren't there. While working alone in the basement room, Dr. Chen heard voices speaking in the same ancient language that had been reported during the original Hartwell investigation. When she looked up from her work, she saw dozens of children standing around her, watching silently with those same dark, knowing eyes that had been described in the historical accounts. The children appeared to range in age from toddlers to teenagers, all wearing clothing from the early 1900s. They stood in perfect formation, arranged in the same geometric patterns that had been found carved into various surfaces throughout the investigation. Dr. Chen later wrote that she felt an overwhelming sense of being studied, as if these entities were cataloging her thoughts and memories. When Dr. Chen called out to her colleagues, the children vanished instantly, but their presence had left physical evidence behind. The temperature in the room had dropped by 30 degrees, visible in the frost that had formed on the stone walls. More disturbing were the footprints in the dust, dozens of small shoe prints that surrounded the area where Dr. Chen had been working. Professor Whitman ordered an immediate evacuation of the site. The team's equipment was hastily packed, though much of it had mysteriously malfunctioned during the encounter. The basement room was sealed with concrete, and the entire excavation site was covered with several tons of fill dirt. The university's official explanation for the aborted investigation cited budget constraints and inconclusive findings. Professor Whitman was quietly transferred to a different department, and Dr. Chen took a sabbatical that lasted the remainder of her career. The other team members signed non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from discussing their experiences for 50 years. But the story of the Hartwell family didn't end with the university investigation. Throughout the decades that followed, reports continued to surface from the area around the former farm. Construction workers building new homes in the expanding suburbs reported finding children's toys and clothing buried in their excavations, items that appeared to be from the early 1900s but were in perfect condition despite being underground for decades. Local hospitals began documenting a strange phenomenon in the 1950s. Women living within a 10-mile radius of the former Hartwell property were experiencing unusual pregnancies. These cases shared common characteristics: rapid progression, multiple births, and children who displayed advanced development from birth. Most disturbing were the reports from nurses who claimed these newborns watched them with an intelligence that was far beyond normal infant capabilities. The medical records from these cases were eventually sealed by court order after a class action lawsuit filed by affected families. The lawsuit claimed that industrial contamination from unknown sources was causing genetic abnormalities in the local population. A settlement was reached out of court, and all records were classified for 99 years. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a pediatrician who worked at Millfield General Hospital during this period, kept private notes about the unusual births she attended. Her journal, discovered after her death in 1987, described newborns who seemed to recognize her from previous deliveries, even though she had never seen them before. She wrote about children who appeared to communicate with each other through glances and gestures, just as the Hartwell children had been described doing 70 years earlier. Most disturbing was Dr. Morgan's account of a conversation she had with one of these children when he was just 3 days old. The infant, who should have been unable to focus his eyes or respond to verbal stimuli, looked directly at her and spoke in clear, adult English. He told her that he remembered her from before and thanked her for her help during previous births. When Dr. Morgan asked what he meant, the child smiled and said, "We've been waiting so long to come back." The 1970s brought a new wave of investigations into the Hartwell case, sparked by the release of Professor Whitman's previously classified research. Paranormal investigators, journalists, and curiosity seekers flocked to the area, hoping to document evidence of supernatural activity. Most found nothing more than local legends and faded newspaper clippings. However, One investigation produced results that couldn't be easily dismissed. In 1978, documentary filmmaker Robert Hayes, no relation to the original Reverend Hayes, spent 3 months researching the Hartwell story for a film about American folklore. His investigation took an unexpected turn when he discovered a cache of photographs hidden in the basement of the old Millfield County Courthouse. The photographs had been taken by Sheriff Crawford during his visits to the Hartwell farm, but they had never been included in the official case files. The images showed dozens of children arranged around the farmhouse and barn. But there was something deeply unsettling about these photographs. The children appeared normal at first glance, but closer examination revealed disturbing details. In every photograph, the children were arranged in perfect geometric patterns. Their positioning was too precise to be natural, suggesting a level of coordination that would be impossible for children of their apparent ages. More disturbing was the fact that many of the children appeared in multiple photographs taken on different days, but their apparent ages remained constant. Children who looked like toddlers in the first photograph still looked like toddlers weeks later, while others had grown dramatically in the same time period. Hayes's film was never completed. During the editing process, he discovered that the photographs seemed to change when viewed through different equipment. Digital scans revealed details that weren't visible in the original prints, including symbols and markings that appeared to be carved into the children's skin. When Hayes tried to show these enhanced images to colleagues, the digital files corrupted themselves, leaving behind only fragments of incomprehensible data. The final piece of evidence Hayes uncovered was Thomas Hartwell's journal, which had been stored in the county records office since the original investigation. The journal contained detailed accounts of the family's experiences, written in Thomas's increasingly deteriorating handwriting. But the most disturbing entries were those written in the ancient language the children had spoken. Hayes hired linguistics experts from 3 different universities to translate these passages, but none could identify the language or provide meaningful translations. However, one expert, Dr. Maria Santos from UCLA, noted that the symbols and grammatical structures were consistent with languages that predated known human civilization by thousands of years. Dr. Santos's analysis suggested that the language might be related to prehistoric communication systems, but she couldn't explain how a simple Indiana farmer could have learned to write in such an ancient tongue. Her report concluded that either Thomas Hartwell had access to archaeological knowledge that wouldn't be discovered by mainstream science for decades, or he had learned the language from a source that predated recorded human history. The investigation into the Hartwell case took its final turn in the 1990s, when advances in ground-penetrating radar technology allowed researchers to conduct non-invasive surveys of the former farm site. The results revealed a network of underground chambers beneath the property, far more extensive than the single basement room discovered by Professor Whitman's team. These chambers appeared to extend for miles underground, connecting to similar structures beneath other properties throughout the county. The radar images showed rooms arranged in the same geometric patterns that had characterized the Hartwell children's behavior, suggesting that the underground network had been designed according to some kind of master plan. More disturbing were the thermal readings taken during the surveys. Despite being abandoned for nearly a century, the underground chambers showed signs of recent activity. Temperature variations suggested movement within the tunnels, and several survey teams reported hearing sounds coming from below ground during their investigations. In 1995, a team of urban explorers illegally entered one of the underground chambers through a hidden entrance they discovered in the woods. Their exploration lasted only a few hours before they were forced to evacuate due to what they described as overwhelming feelings of being watched. Video footage from their helmet cameras showed tunnel walls covered in the same symbols that had been found in the Hartwell basement, but these carvings appeared to be much older and more extensive. The explorers also documented evidence of recent habitation in the tunnels, fresh footprints in the dust, recently disturbed furniture, and what appeared to be children's toys scattered throughout the chambers. Most disturbing was their discovery of a large room that appeared to be set up as a nursery, complete with dozens of cribs arranged in perfect geometric formations. When the urban explorers tried to return to the site with better equipment, They found that the entrance had been sealed with stones and earth. Attempts to locate other entrances were unsuccessful, and subsequent ground-penetrating radar surveys showed no evidence of the tunnel system they had documented. It was as if the entire underground network had simply disappeared. The official records say the Hartwell family never existed as described in the local legends. Historians point to census data showing only Thomas and Martha, with no mention of children. Skeptics explain the reports as mass hysteria, a case of rural communities creating elaborate folklore to cope with isolated tragedies. But the evidence keeps surfacing. Every few years, construction projects in Millfield County uncover artifacts that don't belong in Indiana soil. Children's clothing from the early 1900s found buried 20 feet underground. Toys carved from materials that don't match any known manufacturing techniques from that period. And always those same symbols carved into rocks and tree roots, spreading like an infection through the earth itself. The families living in the area know something the historians don't. They know about the children who appear in photographs they don't remember taking. They know about the voices that whisper in languages that predate human civilization. And they know that somewhere beneath their feet, in chambers that exist outside normal space and time, the Hartwell family is still growing. Because in 1909, Marthe Hartwell didn't just pray for children. She opened a door that should have stayed closed forever. And doors, once opened, are very difficult to shut. The question isn't whether the Hartwell family really existed. The question is whether they ever truly left.